Welcome to Sports Tech HQ, a show where we explore the cutting edge of technology that is transforming the world of sports. I'm Jeff Hintz, and today I'm joined by Mark Branstad, founder and CEO, and Brian Spilbeler, head of sales at Tracking Football, a recruiting and athletic analytics service providing unique athletic scores on football players nationwide. Mark, Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Appreciate it.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So can you just tell us a little bit about the inception of Tracking Football, what it is, give our listeners kind of a description of what you do?
Well, initially it started, Brian and I both were high school teachers and coaches together at Franklin Central High School on the southeast side of Indianapolis. And really very simple, meager starting. We were trying to get more football athletes out for track and more track athletes out for football. We were both, I was the head track coach for several years, and we both coached freshman football together, and then Brian graduated up to the varsity level. But really, that's kind of how it started, and then it really was just sort of, he and I doing research on NFL players and what their athletic backgrounds in high school were, and then, again, this was almost 20 years ago, so it was a little different than today. We kind of put up posters and handed out flyers, trying to submit like information to athletes about, that combination of being a multi-sport athlete and, how that could connect to make you a better athlete and keep you busy during the off season. It's really how it got started.
Okay. So track and football, kind of the blend of that.
Yes.
Okay. So I guess, can you explain kind of the product or service that you offer to, is it directly to the athletes or is it the universities or?
Well, I think what we learned as we were trying to encourage these athletes to go out for both sports was that, first of all positions in football, there was a place for them in track and field because you have the sprinting events, you have the jumping events, you have the throwing events. And so we were kind of struck by how diverse the background of football players was in track and field. And so track and field data as a standard has been, timed at a standardized way for decades. And it's a historical, relevant, world where you can always kind of understand the context of the information. And so really what we were doing when we were attracting players to go out for track and then learning about past players was, conducting this research to get this data set so that then, we could leverage the data of what did all these past greats look like? How big were they? How tall were they? What positions did they play? What track and field events did they do? What were their marks? What were their times? And it gave us this data set that then we felt like was kind of interesting and unique and proprietary, but really relevant to, football, because football is played by bigger, faster, stronger people. And so, I'll kind of let Mark explain then, how this interest in the data then grew out some kind of proprietary analytics that then eventually we were able to build the company around.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things too is like back then, everything was sort of anecdotal. Everything was in print, right? So you had to, you sort of had to go, and it was time, it was really time intensive, and you had to do a lot of research.
Sure.
And there wasn't a lot of that kind of stuff out there. So I think when we were starting to put a lot of it together, we were getting some questions. As the internet continued to erupt, as people would actually reach out to us like about insights. And, I think that's where we started to feel like, hey, maybe there's a little more to this. And like Brian said, we started to connect the dots about, it's one thing to say a guy runs, 10.5 in the 100 meters, he's fast, but looking in the body type, right? Like how big is that athlete?
Okay.
And that's where I think things really started to take off, because then we were able to put together the body type, the position, and then their track performance, whether they were a thrower or a jumper, and create scores. And that is where things really started to change for us. And that's where I think the hook came in. The athletes didn't really care about the scores, but there was a business aspect to this. Hey, maybe we could take all this data and our scores and provide them to college evaluators.
I see.
That's where it really started to change.
Okay. So you've been gathering data now for about 8 years or so.
Longer than really back when we were high school teachers, almost 20 years ago.
Oh,
I mean, it's been compounding for that long.
Wow.
Now, the way in which we can gather it today looks a lot different than it did 20 years ago.
Yeah. So what'd you do back then?
I mean, it was
clicker,
media guides,
yeah,
and it was Excel
print.
sheets,
Yeah,
and it was gather it as however you can get your hands on it, gather it. I mean, he would order media guides from eBay, but that historic relevance was key, right? Like we could pull up Florida State's 1993 media guide, and they would have blurbs about what those athletes were running in high school track, because on these player bios, track data was always there.
Okay.
And so on top of that, now you have, a plethora of sources of information for track results, for athletic results in general. And so it's a lot different now collecting it, and the volume is vast now. But at its core was that historic context, that understanding of what did the greats look like. And now we essentially know what every NCAA rostered player at the football, D3 all the way up to Division I looked like when they were in high school. And we've created profiles and are able to tell that backstory.
So you're like back testing, kind of.
Exactly. And that's kind of, taking back testing, taking a step back for just a second on track data. What makes track so special, and Brian kind of touched on it, was the standardization. So, if you look at an athlete like Bo Jackson, for example, Bo Jackson graduated high school in the early 1980s, but 100 meters, 100 yards is the same in Alabama as it is here in Indiana. Yeah. So you can, at least in the sense of the performance, even in today's world, you can compare those things. The shot put was 12 pounds back then; it's 12 pounds today.
Sure.
The long jump, the structure is the same. There's standardization. So, it's not to say that just because a kid, runs the same, time that Bo Jackson did, he's going to be the same kind of football player. But it's a little bit more of an apples to apples comparison. And you can, like you said, you can back test all the way into the 80s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So you got data way back.
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah.
And are you helping find athletes that may not have been a football player, that, taking that track data and maybe having conversations with those individuals or the teams?
Well, so what's interesting is that, and one of the things we'll always tell everybody is, hey, look, if we're able to get a football player that came out for track, and this happened in our experience as coaches, and guy that kid that mainly played football, he comes out for track and is pretty good and was able to get a scholarship or be able to be a track walk on at a university. That's great, right? Or if we were able to convince a kid to go out and wrestle, who normally wouldn't. And Brian, coach was a wrestling coach for a little bit at FC, and that's terrific. And to your point, I mean, that's one of the things that we try to preach is, hey, if we can get football players other opportunities in other sports, great, then we'll do that. And we've had a few universities where, like, the track staff actually has accessed tracking football. The football staff purchased service, but then the track staff has access to it, and they've looked at, well, what football players are standout track athletes, and hey, if there's if we can get that cross-pollination success, more power to it.
Yeah. So Brian, as a head of sales, so you're going into universities. I see you're on the road quite a bit, it looks like.
Yeah.
And feel free, if you want to name names, you can name names of some of the partners that you have or some of the organizations that are using your service. But what exactly are you, like when you go and you have this conversation with them, what exactly are you selling?
We're selling them access to a website is essentially, I mean, software as a service is really what we are in the business of selling. And so we are subscription based. There's annual subscriptions that college football programs are able to purchase from us. And a variety of different people that work for that school would access the website.
Okay.
So, the pitch has evolved and we've got some really great partners, and actually recently have had a merger acquisition with a company that has kind of taken us into a whole other stratosphere, we think. And, but at its core is that this idea that we can take anecdotes that these coaches or that these scouts would have known what they looked like, what they played like, and we can, apply our insights to those guys. That really helps them to anchor, okay, well, what do I know to be true about a player? And evaluation is going to inherently be biased. It's going to have subjectivity.
Sure.
As football coaches ourselves, we accept and understand the subjective nature of scouting, but we also feel like the objective truths that are there. Look, if the guy's 5'8" and he's 165 pounds and he runs an 11.9 and he plays wide receiver, this is where he falls on the spectrum of every player that you've ever evaluated. Mm-hmm. And because there's so great a volume of players available to play college football, and because they have limited amount of scholarships and so on, they're really trying to funnel down to the highest amount of signal that they can as quickly as they can. And so our data set is full of profiles that then we build tools using our scores and a variety of other ways to help them narrow down. And then also when they find players that they are interested in, they can compare them to everybody that they have on their roster. Wow. And so there's this language that we've created with the website that it's been interesting to see the adoption of just data in general in evaluation. I mean, at first we were always compared to Moneyball, and it wasn't quite Moneyball. other than there were data insights. And we resisted that comparison. But I think it's interesting that today now, as the world of college football has evolved and what it looks like to build a roster, they need as much intelligence as they can get on the players that they're going to add. And we are a hub for that information.
So this is 100% a roster building tool for them, recruiting high school athletes and then into the portal now too, or no?
Yes, and I'll sort of let Brian touch on that because, as he pointed out, we've acquired a company called Sports Source Analytics that really is their primary proficiency is in production data. But the CEO of that company, who's now our CTO, has worked with Brian to build some portal tools. And I'll kind of let him talk a little bit more about that because that's where it's not just high school athletes, it's also players that are in the portal.
This is a constant thing for these coaches, right?
You're constantly evaluating players. And now because you start at the high school level and then you decide whether or not they're good enough for a scholarship, well, now that a college player could enter the portal and now end up on a different college roster. Well, because we've had the backlog and because we had always kept hold of all the profiles that we had ever built and used them as the context, then all of a sudden we made those available right back to the clients and said, well, look, if this is a guy that enters the portal, we have a bunch of truths on him from what he looked like in high school. And we partnered with this company, Sports Source, because they were keeping track of all of the in-game production data, how many tackles, how many sacks, how many rushing yards. Okay. And so this story of statistical compilation just keeps building. And so now, instead of just athletic score systems, we have production scoring systems that we've built. So based on, what position the athlete plays, based on objective statistics that would be garnered from that position, we then can build a comparable production score that bakes into effect, like, well, what level of competition did this player play against? What level of competition was he surrounded by? If he played for Georgia and he got this many yards, that's not the same as a guy getting that many yards at another school, right? Based on who you play against and who you play for.
Oh yeah, this gets deep.
And so now we're trying to standardize it, and this language of scores is really important to our users. And I think that anybody can provide data, but I think what we've really tried to build our company around is the ability to contextualize data in a language that football evaluators can adopt, and it supplements like their eye, because film is film. Like, you're always going to default to what you see. And as coaches, we know that, but if you can build your case with more information to find the right people, then that's really what's special.
You said. We've got a couple truths on that player, and that's like the source of truth, right? Is the data.
Yes.
So, okay. So you talked a little bit about kind of your scoring system. You got a platform, it has a dashboard, you got team pages, player profiles, with personal information, athletic grades. Can you talk a little bit more about, like, you've got, and you don't have to give away the farm here, like, you don't have to give away your secret sauce, but it looks like there's three areas: is the player athletic index, the strength coefficient score, and the combined score tools that your teams utilize, right? You talk a little bit more about those and kind of how they differentiate from each other.
Yeah, so our foundational score is called Player Athletic Index, PAI. That's really our track and football score. So really what
combine.
Yeah, exactly. That's taking track data, track performance, and then applying it to football players, right? Okay. So, and that's where the score is not just the track performance. It also then takes into account the body type and then the position, right, or the projected position. So it's really those three things. So it's not that complicated, but that's part of the reason why it works. Yep. And historically, it works really well because there's not a ton of information, and it's algorithmic based, but there's not a ton of things that go into it. Like when we discuss with our clients, like, this is what goes into the PAI. A lot of times they're like, that's it, really? That's it. Yeah. But historically, over time, that's why it works pretty well. There's a lot of signal there, but really that's what it is. It's the track performance, whether it's sprints, throws, hurdles, you name it, even relays. It's the body type of the player and then the position. Okay. And then the other reason why it works is we're able to back test it against, these tens of thousands of players that we have at the same position, right? So, and then we can break it down to, if it's Alabama that's looking at this, or, if it's the University of Indianapolis, that would be looking at, our dashboard in our system. They can tailor it to, okay, well, what do players look like that have signed with us at that position?
I see.
Based on the scores.
Okay.
Right. So it's hyper contextualized for whatever, client or customer is looking at it.
Okay.
And with all these scores, so the high school combine score is now focused on those more traditional combine events, the 40, the shuttle, the broad jump, the vertical jump, which high school camps exist across the country. And then colleges themselves invite these kids to their summer camps in June, and they test all those pieces of information. And certainly there's a lot of, companies in the space that provide that data, or the schools themselves gather it. But again, it's that idea that we took a sample set of the types of players that these colleges would want and modeled what they looked like when they tested in those events.
Okay.
And so we built a score for that. So I think in general, like all of our scores, we try to make it very transparent what it's focused on. And it's not some big black box. To Mark's point, you're dealing with football coaches that are suspicious to begin with anybody that's telling them anything beyond what their eyes tell them. And so we wanted to be very clear, like, this isn't a black box. This doesn't have dozens and dozens of inputs. This is not actually all that complex. This is intuitive. If you can take guys that these college coaches and scouts have seen even 15, 20 years ago, and those are my favorite examples, is when you start to ask them, like, well, tell me a guy 15 years ago that really excelled athletically for you. And we can pull up that player's profile and say, well, this is how our numbers would have graded him. And when that meets like his intuition, that's when he really starts to understand the score, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, the whole
validates.
It validates, and it won't always. And that's the other part of it that we really try to impress upon people is this doesn't mean that he's going to be a good football player.
Right.
This means this is how he looks in comparison to good football players. It just happens to be that
Purely supplemental.
our scores tend to skew higher the better the football player population, but it is not a replacement for your judgment on whether he can play football for you.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So when I think about historical, I'm thinking about like the best football players at their positions. I'm going to put you on the spot here. Because I'm not paying for your service right now, but maybe we should. But I just think of like, wide receiver that comes into mind that played back in the late 90s. And like, is that the gold standard? Like a Randy Moss type of like just his speed and his ability and his body type. Like when you say who's the best at these positions, can you give that to us? Like who's the best? Like
right.
Running.
Well, so we've been asked before, like who is sort of if there's a prototype, like for the PAI score, for the Player Athletic Index, the track and football score. I would always say like Bo Jackson, right?
Which you said, yeah.
Yeah, which I said earlier, maybe, a little bit of the Freudian slip there, but but Randy Moss would certainly be one of those guys at wide receiver. Because to your point, like the body type, right? He's 6'4", even at high school, I think he's around 200 pounds. Yeah. What's interesting about Randy is that he was also a big time multi-sport athlete. He played basketball, he played baseball too. He's a really good basketball player, and that's one of the things I know we get asked about, like the multi-sport side of things, where we don't actually, we score the track side, but we don't necessarily score like multi-sport. But to us, being a multi-sport is an intangible, right? And, people ask us questions about like, well, you guys put out stats about like the NFL draft and how many of these guys, including Randy Moss, were had athletic backgrounds in high school. To us, it's more of an intangible, and it probably says something historically about wanting to compete, being a competitor, right? So that's really, but certainly Randy Moss would be one of those. There's some others, like linebacker would be probably like Junior Seau. Okay. Was a really good thrower, also was a 3-sport athlete, et cetera. So yeah, there are those archetype players, at each position.
Right.
But what's interesting is that you can see some of these really high scored players even today, like right here in the state of Indiana. So, again, it's like Brian said, it's not necessarily to say like, well, this guy has a score comparable to Randy Moss. Is he going to be Randy Moss? No. Right. But from a body type, track performance, position, standardization. Yeah. I mean, he has the equivalent, physical attributes.
Tell me about quarterback. Cause I think like in my mind, I think quarterback might be a little bit different.
I think you're nailing it. It is. So when you look at this multi-sport study, and we've actually put a lot of content out, and it's some of the content that got us the most attention was just this around the NFL draft. Like what percentage of NFL drafted players played another sport in high school, right? And that was something that we've done for over a decade on X, and it's pretty well established that football still is played by a bunch of guys that played a lot of sports when they were in high school. But quarterback, out of all the positions, tends to be one of the most specialized, right? Now, when you look at track data and you look at quarterback, it is the one position at the lowest participation rate. So only about a third
Okay.
of drafted quarterbacks did track and field in high school.
Wow.
But at that same point, like many of them played basketball or played baseball. So could we give a score, an athletic score using track data for, only more than a third of quarterbacks? No, we can't. Tight end would be the other position that is, very much with basketball. There's a huge connection between really good tight ends and then a basketball background.
Yeah.
Not as much with track.
Tony
There you go.
Gonzalez,
And so, but that's been a standard for decades. I mean, I think, and I've got 3 young kids myself, and I coach all the sports, and you see this push for specialization in local sports. I'm sure across the country.
What do you think about that?
I'm very much opposed to it.
Right.
Look, I'm not to judge any one individual's decision, but when it comes to football, and that's what we always say, like, we are not talking about professional basketball or baseball or anything else. We're talking about football.
Right.
The bottom line is that specializing in football at a young age certainly does not increase your chances of achieving at high levels in football, right? I can't speak to the other sports, but it doesn't look like that in football. And one, we dive deep in this, but I wanted to make a point about these anchor players, like even a Tyreek Hill, which is a very popular player and people know him because he's fast. You can be really fast and you can grade out to be one of the fastest players that we've ever seen. But like our score wouldn't be at the height for Tyreek Hill. He's more like, in the above average range, but that's that size factor.
Oh, because of the size.
And body type.
And
right.
It sounds like we're diving deep and maybe a little nerdy on this, but what's really fascinating is in the last 8 years, football coaches and scouts, they adopt this lens. They are looking at this data in ways that 8 years ago they weren't. And so it's very encouraging to feel like, you're in an environment where you're helping to push knowledge, you're helping to push different perspective, and allowing the data to be what it is and to supplement their processes.
Yeah. And I think, the specializing so early, I think as parents, one may think that that's probably the way to go if you want your kid. But I think hockey has gone through American Development Model. I know golf has done it. And the research is there that the more your kids can play in multiple sports, it actually is better for them in the sport that they end up choosing long run.
Yeah.
There's a lot of literature about burnout. It's something that Mark and we've been talking. And look, if you think about our origin, it was that we were multi-sport coaches trying to encourage multi-sport participation at a high school locally here. And that hasn't changed. I'm very much concerned about some of the things that we see when it revolves around specialization. And I don't think that it's necessarily in the best interest of the kids.
Right. So kind of counterintuitive, you think, like the more time my kids spend here, but burnout's a real thing. Did Andrew Luck play more than just football?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Baseball, basketball. Peyton.
Oh wow.
Peyton was a baseball, basketball guy. Drew Brees. You name it. And that's what's interesting is that some of the some of the gurus will say, that the pitching motion can ruin quarterbacks.
Sure.
But if you look at a lot of the greatest, and again, they've thought they were about talent, but you go way back, whether it's, Marino and Manning and all those guys played baseball. Tom Brady, right? Obviously a basketball, baseball guy. So, and some of that probably speaks to those guys were just really talented. But I think our overarching thing is that we've always said it's not necessarily about doing those other sports to become a better football player. It's really more a mechanism to keep the, that competitive edge. And I think that's the intangible that we always push with that is, I think when you get the guy that's the 4-sport athlete and maybe the kid that wasn't, one of the things you can be a little more confident in maybe is that there's a competitor, there's a leadership quality there.
Right. Okay. So over 3,700 players were added to Tracking Football's database this month alone. What does this signify, for you as kind of the growth and what's on the horizon and where we're going with, like, that's a lot of players to add to your platform, in a month.
Yeah.
I think it seems like things are going pretty well.
Yeah. Well, we'll give a shout to our data team. Those guys, they do a terrific job. Tyler Lysings, our director of ops, and he does a great job with all of our other people that, even right now as we're speaking here are doing, looking at data and everything. We've made some partnerships with some high school combines that like Brian had mentioned earlier, that are supplying us with data and with names and performances of athletes. So that's really helped to expand that too. But overall, really, it's our data team that now does a really good job of going out and continuing to add names, and then the transfer portals help too, because now we're really focused on creating profiles and rosters for every NCAA team, whether that's Power 5 through Division 3. So
Wow.
that's in that number is included college players too.
Sure.
Yeah.
So when you think of like what it looks like in a couple of years, what does expansion look like for you for football? You just keep going. You keep going all the way down to D3, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think that football is where we want to stay.
Okay.
For the foreseeable future. A lot of times we get asked, well, what about, how does this apply to other sports and so on? But I think there's a lot more opportunity in football, and just in the last 2 or 3 years, with how college football, namely, has really adjusted, and the way in which rosters are going to be built in the future, and then all of that movement, and then how rosters will be valued in the future is really something that we're interested in and keeping an eye on, because I think that when you have high stakes decisions, you need to provide as much evidence as possible. And certainly we'll want to continue to expand and deepen our scope. Right now, we work with a junior college. We work with a D3 program,
Wow.
D2,
Okay.
Division 1, NFL. So we've already hit kind of all the different tranches of football. And I think we want to try to deepen that client count. But you mentioned the profiles, and I think I sit back and I think back to, when we started just the company 8 years ago. It was in a bedroom at his house with just a couple folks, and now there's almost a dozen employees, and that we can be here doing this and having a discussion, knowing that the machine is churning what it's churning, and the fact that in 8 years, that's something that's been built, from two guys that met as high school teachers, is always something that is in my brain.
That's really cool. Yeah, your entrepreneurial journey probably started as a little side hustle, maybe first.
Yeah, well, that's what's so interesting. Yeah, is it really, I think a lot of people, a lot of the other services will say, for coaches by coaches.
Okay.
We don't actually use that, but it's the truth. I mean, we started as high school teacher and coaches, and we're probably not as vocal about that side of the story as we should be.
Yeah.
I think, to your point, we're running hard and we're trying to scale the business and continue to build it. But yeah, that's so quintessential to what track and football is really a story of, a couple of teachers and coaches that got together and, started it. And kind of it took a long time. So I don't want to say we didn't have much success as it is a side hustle.
Sure.
But once it started to scale, it's kind of taken off.
Okay. So I'm going to take a guess here. Math teachers? Am I right?
Social studies.
Studies.
Yeah.
And so he was the social studies and history guru, and I was the communications teacher.
Okay.
And so that blend of head of sales, and then, it's been an interesting blend. And the other thing that Mark's done a great job of is really leveraging people in his own network and building a network of people that can do things that we aren't capable of doing.
Right.
And I think that that's been a really big part of how we've scaled, is that we've been intelligent enough to understand what our limitations are individually, and then leverage people that we know can handle that. So when it comes to building the scores, we didn't build the scores. We worked with somebody else to build the scores. Right. The web development, we worked with people to develop the website, and have I think done a great job of finding really strong partners along the way that have really helped to make us what we are today.
It's kind of an important crossroads, probably, when you're a founder, is just being able to admit, when it's time to bring on help.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Versus being able to do it all yourself.
We were very fortunate. My dad's a retired business consultant, and he had a group of mathematicians that he worked with. And one of those mathematicians, who's been a quintessential part of what we are from the beginning, he's really helped us and really has been, in control of a lot of the math behind the scores and the algorithms and everything else. But we have a really, really good partner in terms of, development, technology development. But that's really allowed Brian and myself and some of the others to really focus on, scaling and building the business and doing research and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So that's where it's on the one hand, we get a lot of help, but it's really allowed us to focus on the areas that allow us to build the business.
Right. Okay. That's great. And then you kind of mentioned competitors a little bit. I guess what sets you guys apart and your company apart from competitors? I'm sure there's other services. You don't need to mention names or anything, but why do
as you can imagine, it's any sport, it's crowded space, right? There's there's lots of competitors that do things really, really well. I think one of the things that we wrapped our arms around really early was there's really most of the services when we got started, football services were very traditional, right? They'd go out to games and, and again, Brian's got a lot of chops as a former player and a coach, but that's not what we do, right? And there's a lot of services that provide data, but not a lot of them leaned into, providing analytics on that data, customization and things like that, building understanding of the data. That's what we really leaned into. And I think that still to this day kind of sets us apart from a lot of the other services.
Okay.
And I think that beyond product has just been the relationships that we've built within the industry. I think Mark and I have really always felt like we were part of the industry, as he mentioned earlier, and that we wanted to help promote and evangelize really what we were trying to do, but also connect those that were in the industry. So there's been this really big emergence in college football within like personnel departments, and people equate it to like what the NFL front office looks like compared to the position coaches. And it's not quite that, but there's definitely been a big increase in support staff at football programs, and tracking football as an entity has really created an environment where they can connect with one another. We've hosted networking events out in Las Vegas and sponsored initiatives around all of that. And I think we've always felt like that was a very important aspect of what we could represent in the space. And so while I think our product definitely stands out for a lot of reasons and does things a little different than others, I also think that our company represents a relationship that has kind of crossed maybe some barriers that you would typically see with like a vendor client interaction.
Sure. Okay. So it looks like the future of football is bright with, the Olympics taking on flag football in 28 here in the United States and LA. So that's a good signal for football and where we're going. I know there was kind of like a dip, maybe just everybody worried about concussion protocol and all that, but with some of the rule changes and some of the modifications the leagues and even college is making to make it a safer environment, hopefully we see, player participation increase and you guys continue to be all over it. So you said you want to stick with football for now. My last question for you, do you see another sport in the future? I know it seems like you specialize because of the track and the football blend, but do you see maybe another sport that this could parlay over into?
Possibly. And I think it's probably around, like our combine sports, the camps, right? There are a lot of sports now that run camps and try to, test for athleticism. And it's a little different than the football athleticism. But, I think there are some areas we've been approached. We've kind of demurred and stayed away from a little bit, but like lacrosse, there's a few others, even the baseball, which is, super technical now, even at the junior high and high school level with the testing and everything. Yeah. But I think those are a few areas where, we have some opportunities maybe to cross over, like on the camp testing.
Yeah. And I think we always want to dominate our niche, right? And I think that as long as we see an area that we can be best in class in providing a service for, and maybe do it with that nuance and that proprietary nature, I think we'll take on that opportunity. I think roster building is something that we're learning a lot about, which certainly transcends football. And if you then, look at basketball, for example, the same things that football has gone through at the college level with transfers, you're seeing at the basketball as well. So, I think that there will be opportunities, but I think we've always been very, very keyed in on like, let's just make sure that what we are doing, we are the best at doing it. And if it makes sense to grow and build, then that's what we do. And I think right now we're still having a lot of fun finding all sorts of opportunities and uncovering need, within the specific industry that we're in.
That's great. Kudos to you guys. Congratulations on all the success. That's Mark Branstad, founder and CEO, and Brian Spilbeler, head of sales at Tracking Football. Thank you so much for joining us, what you're doing really to help with roster building for these football coaches all over the country. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of Sports Tech HQ. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. And remember, stay tuned for our next episode where we'll be exploring another exciting innovation in the world of sports tech.